All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know that a lot of you are still coming into the room, but we want to be mindful of our time for this evening. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday evening. Honestly, I'm not sure if there's really a better way to sort of kick off your weekend than I think with this lineup that we have in store for you in just a moment. My name is Keith Simmons. I'm the Communications Director at Florida Humanities, and I'm going to introduce tonight's program, and I'm going to also introduce the moderator for the program, who will then introduce our panelists for this evening. In 2020, Florida Humanities launched this series, The Long History of Race Relations in Florida, in response to George Floyd's murder in May of that year. The intent was to develop a broad public understanding of Black history in Florida, knowing that while each state has distinct characteristics to its history, the undercurrents tend to be universal. These programs were created with the vital assistance of Dr. David Jackson, the Associate Provost for Graduate Education and Dean of the Graduate College at Florida A&M University, and Steve Seibert, Executive Director Emeritus at Florida Humanities. Over 900 people joined us for those first 4 programs that comprise part 1 of this series. Tonight, we continue that conversation. Faith and Fortitude, Stories of Black Women in Florida is a 3-part series that emphasizes the experiences of Black women in Florida. We can honestly think of no better way to celebrate Women's History Month than by starting off with these topics. Now, as I said, I'm going to introduce the moderator for tonight's program in just a moment, but first I want to cover a few housekeeping items. You can participate in tonight's program by entering your questions using the Q&A function of Zoom. We'll do our best to try to integrate as many questions as possible into the conversation. We would like to mention that conversations on race and history can sometimes invoke passion. Our goal is to create an opportunity for dialogue that is honest and respectful. Florida Humanities does not necessarily endorse the opinions of panelists or of any audience members. Now, there's one additional program that's going to be coming up on Tuesday, March 9th at 6 p.m. It's Refusing to Be Silenced, The Political History and Future of Black Women in Florida. If you're interested in that program or curious about any of the other programs that we have coming up, you can learn more by visiting us on our website, floridahumanities.org/events. Now, for those of you that missed part 1 of our series, Faith and Folklore, Sites and Black Women's Stories in the 20th Century, you can also go to our website where we have the recording available for that program. At the end of tonight's presentation, you'll receive a short feedback survey in your email. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take a few moments and fill it out for us. Let us know how we did, ways that we can improve next time, and topics that you might be interested in hearing about in the future. And finally, your support is essential for helping to sustain these programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we ask you to consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support to contribute to our organization and to make programs like this possible. And now to introduce tonight's moderator. Dr. Tamika Hobbs is an Associate Provost and Associate Professor of History at Florida Memorial University, the only historically Black university in South Florida. She is the author of Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida, and a member of the Florida Humanities Speakers Directory. And with that, I turn the program over to you, Dr. Hobbs.
Thank you very much, Keith. I want to thank you for allowing me this opportunity, as well as for the Florida Humanities for their continued investment in storytelling across our state. These programs have tremendous value, and I want to recognize the foresight of Florida Humanities of recognizing the need for this type of reflection, as you said, given the aftermath of not only the murder of George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. I had the privilege of serving on a panel that was coordinated by Dr. David Jackson during the first iteration of this series last fall. And it is indeed my pleasure to be with you here again this evening. So thank you to you and to our audience this evening. Welcome and thank you for being with us. As Keith said, my name is Dr. Tamika Hobbs. I'm Associate Provost for Academic Affairs at Florida Memorial University. And I'm going to be the moderator for tonight, as for all of the other conversations in this series. And of course, this is being brought to you because it is Women's History Month. We're still in the very first week of that observation. And I'm very excited about these conversations and the opportunities to uplift the unique stories of Black women here in Florida. The timing could not be better. I think that Black women have been a part of the national conversation over the past few months because of the stellar accomplishments of both Vice President Kamala Harris and Harris, and as well as Stacey Abrams and her work in Georgia. But I see them as examples. They are not aberrations of the long history of Black women's service, their dedication, their leadership in the African American community and in this nation writ broadly. And I see this conversation as a way to uplift those stories that are specific to the state of Florida. As I did during our first session, I want to begin by reading just a brief quote from the introduction of a book that came out last year. The title of it is A Black Women's History of the United States, and it was written by Dana Ramey Berry and Callie Nicole Gross. And they make a statement that I thought was really appropriate for us as we undertake these conversations, and it is that Black women's history is the Black women's history in the United States is broad, beautiful, exciting, haunting, and crucial to the understanding of the nation. It is a testament to the intellectual richness and vitality of Black women. This history also holds the country accountable for its unmet promise to make democracy serve all equally. And while Berry and Gross are describing the national situation, we know, of course, that this is also true for us here in the state of Florida. So I'm excited to bring this conversation to you. Yes, Black History Month was last month, and we had a chance to do some really good work then in telling stories. But it's often Black women who end up getting lost and falling into this gap in these conversations around achievement and remembrance. And this is part of what we hope to correct as a part of this series. Last time we were together, we had the benefit of talking about Black women's histories and stories and sites from the oldest part of our state. Of course, we're talking about the northern part, ranging from Pensacola, Tallahassee, and Jacksonville. I had the privilege of engaging discussants like my mentor, Althemise Barnes, one of my former students, Tiniade Broughton, and Adonica Toller. And we had a wonderful conversation that was exploratory and planted the seed for what I hope to be this very similar conversation tonight. Tonight, as Keith said, we're talking about faith and folklore, and we're moving ourselves forward a little bit in geography as we migrate from the northern part of the state to the central part of the state, but definitely taking a leap forward in our chronology as we explore the late 19th and earliest century, the earliest 20th century for these stories. And so I'm really excited about what we're going to hear tonight. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers this evening. We have with us Dr. Ashley Robertson Preston, who is a lecturer in the African American Studies program at the University of Florida. She received her doctorate in African diaspora history and public history from Howard University. Ashley is the author of 3 books, and her research interests include African American women's involvement in World War II, the activism of Mary McLeod Bethune, who will be focal to our conversation tonight, and the Black Women's Club movement. Also joining us is Julian Chambliss. He is a professor of English with an appointment in history at Val Berryman and the Val Berryman Curator of History at MSU Museum at Michigan State University. He is a core participant in the MSU College of Arts and Letters Consortium for Critical Diversity in the Digital Age. His research focuses on race, identity, and power in real and imagined urban spaces. His recent writing has appeared in Phylon, Frieze, Rhetoric Review, and the Boston Review. An interdisciplinary scholar, he has designed museum exhibitions, curated art shows, and created public history projects that trace community identity and power in the United States. His most recent book projects include Assembling the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Essays on the Social, Cultural, and Geopolitical Domain, published in 2018, and Cities Imagined, the African Diaspora in Media and History in 2018. I could go on and on. He's done some award-winning podcasts here in Florida, And we're just really glad to have him and to learn more about his work. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Amina Shakir, who is an instructor at the College of Education at Florida A&M University. Dr. Shakir is a graduate of the University of Miami, and her fields of interest include women's history, modern African American race, gender, and health, and health activism. Her research explores the intersection of race, health, and gender. Her book project, Rattling the Collective Consciousness, Dr. Helen Dickens and the Health Activism in the Post-War America, argues that Black physicians used medical professionalization as a space and place for activism during the Jim Crow and post-civil rights eras. And she also has received the National Endowment for Humanities Fellowship and has been a featured lecturer on C-SPAN. And so we're really excited and glad to have them with us here tonight. But we are going to go ahead and get started and dive into our conversation. I'd like to begin with Dr. Preston, because your story deals with the history that you're going to give us, deals with a personality who many of us who know anything about Florida history should know. And that, of course, is the story of Mary McLeod Bethune. And because we are familiar with her, what I've asked our discussants tonight to do is to really kind of take us away from the known and into the things that we perhaps should know more about the folks that they're going to discuss this evening. And so with that, Dr. Robinson, Dr. Preston, I'd like to bring you into the space and have you talk to us about the legacy in Florida of Mary McLeod Bethune.
So thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm so excited to be with you all. I'm excited because this year I've seen tremendous growth in the interest in Women's History Month. I'm seeing programs all over the place. So I'm excited to be here to talk about my Shiro and the work that she's done in Florida. And so this picture, Dr. Cleo Higgins and Miss Helen Bronson, Miss Bronson was the wife of Dr. Bronson, one of the presidents of Bethune-Cookman College, who served for almost 25 years, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm going to focus on Dr. Cleo Higgins. When I came to Florida in 2013, I met all of these amazing people who knew Miss Bethune. And they wanted to share their stories about, how she would sit on the front porch with them, how she had influenced their family members to go to college, or, it was just overwhelmingly amazing to know that there were people around who still had a memory of her work. And so that's really the inspiration for my first book, just meeting all of these elders and wanting to capture their stories. And so in the book, there are 4 people that I interview, and Dr. Cleo Higgins is one of those folks. She was Mrs. Bethune's protege. She worked at Bethune-Cookman for almost 40 years. She rose to be a VP of Student Affairs, and she worked with Miss Bethune during the time that she came back as president in the 1940s. And so she talks about what it was like for her to walk around campus, how Miss Bethune would go travel and she would come back and she would hold an assembly to talk about the travels, to talk about the people that she met, to really talk about her vision for where the college would go in the future. And so when Dr. Higgins decided to go back to school, she talks about how Miss Bethune made sure that she had funding to go to school, how she would mentor her over the years, and just how much of an impact she had on her life. And so when you look at what Dr. Higgins was able to accomplish, she goes on to be a national president in Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, dedicates almost 40 years to higher education. That was from the seeds that were planted by her mentor, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. And so part of the success of Miss Bethune, it really, really goes back to her mentoring people, to her passing the torch to the next generation. And so Dr. Cleo Higgins, I definitely honor her during this Women's History Month. She's still alive. I believe she's about 96 years old. And She talks about how she just continues to learn. She loves to continue to learn. Been retired for several years, but she's always promoting learning. And all of that really comes from her work with Miss Bethune and being influenced by her. Can go to the next slide. This is Miss Senorita Locklear. I love Miss Locklear. She is one of those people that I met who knew Miss Bethune. I believe she's in her 90s now too. And she was Miss Bethune's last living secretary. She was with her for about the last year of her life. And she talks about what it was like to work with her, how they would start the day every morning with prayer. They would read the upper room, and just how spiritual she was. She also talks about how she really loved her family. She enjoyed her grandchildren. You know, when you think about Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune being this larger than life figure, you know, you don't think about her loving children, but she did. She would spend her birthday with the children. She would have her grandkids to come over and they would play and jump in her bed and everything. So Miss Locklear talks about that and also the work that they did with the Mary McLeod Bethune Foundation. And so I was the director of the Mary McLeod Bethune Foundation for 5 years. That's Miss Bethune's house in Daytona Beach. What she did was in 1953, she opened her home up so that people could come visit, but she also started a foundation to try to raise funds for scholarships and those types of things. And so you have these visitors coming to the home wanting to meet Mrs. Bethune, groups who would come to sit down and talk with her, continuing that mentor-mentee relationship. And so Dr. Cleo, not Dr. Cleo, but Miss Senorita Locklear was right there for all of it. And she talks about how special it was just to continue to work with Mrs. Bethune. And I'll let you read this in the book, but she talks about the last requests, 3 requests that Miss Bethune made on the last day that she was alive. And one of the requests was that she wanted to read the book that she was writing with Rackham Holt. And so it's almost as if she knew that something was going to happen and she wanted to get her affairs together before that day had ended. So we can go to the next. This is Mcleod Hospital. One of the things that I learned about Miss Bethune and her work in coming to Florida was really that whenever she saw a need in the community, she wasn't the type of person to wait for someone else to do something about it. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a medical doctor at all, but she had taken one of her students to the hospital. Her student had been turned away. She was able to eventually get that student admitted. But that moment, it really changed something for her, you know, because she thought about the rest of her students. She thought about the community. What would happen if someone needed to go to the hospital and they were turned away and didn't get that opportunity to be admitted? So she decided to start a hospital in 1911. Mcleod Hospital, she started it and she named it in honor of her parents. It was one of the first Black hospitals in Daytona Beach. Some of the first nurses were trained through Mcleod Hospital and through her school. They had a 3-year program. They would send nurses out into the community to people's homes so that they could do those checkups and those types of things. And Dr. Sheila Flemings, another Bethune scholar, in her text, she talks about the significance of the Mcleod Hospital and the fact that it was able to care for 105 patients. They were able to do community calls and operations. And so as we look at healthcare and inequalities in healthcare in this present moment, you know, we should continue to kind of look at the past to guide us on how to deal with these things. My next slide, and I'm going to make this a quick one because I know I'm almost over my time. Bethune Beach. Bethune Beach was a beach that Mrs. Bethune purchased with some of her very wealthy friends because African Americans didn't have access to the beaches in Daytona and several other places. And so she invited people to invest in this beach to provide a safe space for African Americans. And so a couple of years ago, I was a part of a team that worked on historical markers for this site. Since the past times, it's no longer in the hands of the original owners, but it's so important that we preserve that story for future generations. Can go to the last slide. And this last slide is the home of Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman would go on to be a very influential theologian. If you look at the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, he talks about keeping Dr. Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, always keeping a copy of that book with him at all times. And so he actually grew up in Daytona Beach, was heavily influenced by the work of Miss Bethune, and his wife ended up working with her in the National Council of Negro Women. But the story of Dr. Thurman just goes to show you how even within the Daytona Beach community, she was influencing people to go on to become leaders, many of which who would do great things. And they all point back to just being influenced by her work. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ashley. Those are some really important aspects of the legacy of Mary McLeod Bethune to uplift. I heard you say a few things that I want to call out, and this is something that I've heard, is that your greatest accomplishment as a leader is making sure that you've replaced yourself. And so when you talk to us about Dr. Higgins, we definitely know that that is one of many replacements that Dr. Bethune left behind. I also heard her activity, and I've come to know a term recently called a solutionary. It's not enough to be a revolutionary, but you got to come up with solutions. And so when we talk about racial disparity in healthcare, building a hospital is a way to deal with that. When we talk about exclusion from leisure, buying a beach is a way to address that. And so I think that those are very important pieces of her legacies that would profit us even today as we still continue to struggle with similar issues. And then lastly, I was really glad to see the inclusion of Howard Thurman. I would love to come back and maybe we'll have some time to talk about his wife. You were educating me a little bit about her role and her leadership. I just want to call out that Howard Thurman is also a graduate of the antecedent institution that was Florida Memorial University back when we were in Jacksonville, the Florida Baptist Academy. He was, I believe, the valedictorian of our class of 1919, way back when. And so lots of history there. Okay, well, we're going to pivot now, and I'm going to turn things over to Julian, who will give us another way to look at the life and works of Zora Neale Hurston.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I appreciate the opportunity to present for Florida Humanities Council. Of course, as someone who grew up in Jacksonville and went to the University of Florida, I just want to establish that I do know something about Florida. It's always great to come back and talk about a pivotal figure. And that pivotal figure is Zora Neale Hurston. A lot of my work related to Zora Hurston actually grows from my engagement with digital humanities, using digital tools to understand humane questions. And this is the way that I've really come to think about Hurston as a key figure in a kind of Black recovery project that is ideologically aligned with an emerging sort of theories associated with Afrofuturism. So the reason I say that Zora Neale Hurston has a Black future industry is because I think when we think about the theoretical grounding associated with Afrofuturism, Zora Neale Hurston remains a sort of pivotal figure, inspiring people like Ingrid Lafleur, who's an internationally known curator, Afrofuturist, future thinker, who uses her position as a Black woman to think about what is necessary, what is required to create a more safe, more equitable, and more life-sustaining world. And in this way, I think she, as many Afrofuturists, point to a figure like Hurston as a guiding light, someone who creates a kind of framework to understand both how society can marginalize women of color and what must be done to, in fact, create the context for those women to thrive. And as a consequence, the entirety of Black society and really the wider society to thrive. So why is this important? Well, Alondra Nelson, who you might recognize, has recently been added to the Biden administration, talks about Afrofuturism as several things, but one of the things she talks about it as a Black vision of modernity. And I would put it to you that when we think about Afrofuturism, many theorists like Ronaldo Anderson think about it as a set of tools that people are using to deal with the problems that they have, right? So that the idea of an Afrofuturist toolkit is a toolkit that's allowing people of color globally to look at the systems that they're in and come up with solutions that will propel them into a better future. And this is one of the things that makes the contemporary moment around Afrofuturism important, in the sense that it's a global movement, but its antecedents, its historical root, and the sort of historical thinkers at its base, people like Zora Neale Hurston, are increasingly being revisited and reimagined within this context. And I think it's easy for us to think about this when we think about Hurston as a figure. After all, she has elements that blur the boundary between disciplines and speak to both academic and popular audiences. We know, of course, her background is one that is almost created, but in that creation, she really speaks to the experience of African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century. Born in Alabama, growing up in Florida, but growing up in the first incorporated Black community, she's put in a position to understand that Black people can in fact govern themselves. They can in fact have a kind of civic identity that has been denied them systematically in the 19th century, which they're seeking to achieve as we go into the close of the 20th century. Hurston's work as a scholar in particular, as a nonfiction writer, as a sort of tri-disciplinary person, is something that I think is very crucial to understanding her as Afrofuturist. This is work that's emerging work. My colleague Isaiah Lavender has recently done a piece where he has talked about reimagining Hurston, Their Eyes Are Watching God, as an Afrofuturist text. But I think in particular, when I think about Hurston, I think about her fitting into a broader set of theoretical constructs around Afrofuturism, where she's using her work to create counterfutures in an era hostile to Black people. This is how Kojo Oshun talked about Afrofuturism in one of his earlier theoretical works. This is one of the leading theorists of Afrofuturism. So this idea of counterfutures, telling stories to tell and create a better future, this I think is something that we can recognize in Hurston, but should we recognize it in Afrofuturism? Can we see how that work as Afrofuturist is the thing I think is happening right now? For me, it's easy to think about this because we know that when we think about the future, there's in fact a future industry. The future is not an accident, it is a construction. And I think one of the things that's very important for us to recognize that as we theorize the future, these different elements that create the future industry that we live in can be hacked, can be transformed, and can be made to create better Black futures. And I think that was something that Hurston was engaged in very early on. And in our book in 2018, my colleague and I, Walter Greason, looked to Eatonville and looked to the sort of Washingtonian universe that Eatonville was a part of to recognize that Black people were very early in the 19th century narrativizing a counter future. If you look at the first issue of the Eatonville Speaker, their answer, they put it to the world in this publication: solve the race problem of the United States, buy a home in Eatonville. This is a counter-public space. This is a Black counter-public space designed explicitly to counter the political narrative coming from white supremacists that say that Black people cannot rule themselves. It is also a place where these educational ideology of Booker T. Washington is given full force. One of several sort of satellite communities that are created in the aftermath of Reconstruction and are driven by this idea of both carving out space, but also fomenting and create a foundation for the future. These ideas are central to a kind of counter narrative that we can find in the document and that we can recover and see. It's one of the things that we see happening in Black digital humanities as more and more scholars return to the written record and tell these stories of success that have been obscured by a kind of dominant white narrative. And in doing so, again, Hurston becomes a very important figure. When I think about this Black future industry, I think about it in that context. What if there's a Black future industry? Is there a way that Hurston and her work can be intersewn into this sort of future industry construct and recognized for what it is? I think in the context of her nonfiction work, She does this all the time. And all we have to do is look to see it. I'll give you an example. A famous essay of hers is, I argue, Cataloging Blackness, the hue and cry about Howard University. In that essay, she talks about her embrace of Negro spirituals that her classmate at Howard were rejecting. This, I say to you, is an example of her concrete disassembling of white supremacy and advocacy for a kind of Black metaphysics to be held in equal measure to a white Christian one. This is a perfect example of the kind of Afrofuturist work I associate with Zora Neale Hurston. And I think it's something that all of us who are currently engaged in sort of Afrofuturism should associate Hurston in that same vein. This is another example, her folklore work, so on and so forth. And of course, a core element of Hurston's sort of documented work is the creation and cataloging of the traditional Black cultural expressions. All these things, I think, are an important part of Hurston as an Afrofuturist. And all these things, I think, are things that we should use to align her with a kind of contemporary dialogue about a Black future industry. And I don't want to go over time because I promised the boss I would not. So I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for keeping your promise. But honestly, I could listen to that, a lot more of that. There's just so much power in that example. I'm so grateful for you, Julian, for your research and coming to share with us. And you know, a lot of my time now and my thinking have pivoted around looking back in order to move forward, right? That's the idea of Sankofa. What examples can we pull from the past in order to inform our present and then help us to craft a new future? And this kind of articulation of Afrofuturism is really resonating with me for that reason. I'm very attracted to this idea of counter futures because I know for me, after 2020, we are at a moment, some people have even started using the language of the third Reconstruction, right? The first one coming in after emancipation, that Reconstruction was left incomplete and it required us to come back with what we call the Civil Rights Movement, which could also be termed our second Reconstruction. And there are those who pretend that we're in the midst of a third opportunity in this country to try to get this right. And I think that ideas like this, the concept of counterfuturism, Afrofuturism, and imagining, as you said, a world where Black women can thrive. Because as the saying goes, if we alleviate the suffering of the least of us, then all of us are free. That's coming from the concepts of intersectionality with Kimberly Crenshaw. There's a lot out in the universe that all speaks to this. And so I really thank you for what you are sharing with us. Lastly, and I don't mean to do this, this came up in our last session. I'm going to bring it up for the second time here. It's not that all roads lead to Florida Memorial University, but I do want to mention that Zora Neale Hurston was on our faculty in the 1940s when we were in St. Augustine. So our next panelist, I do not believe has a direct Florida Memorial University connection, but I will work really hard to try to find one. But Dr. Amina Shakir is going to lift up for us probably one of the least known, I would say, statewide figures but I think of someone who is incredibly impactful and that more people should know about. And I've heard Dr. Shakir talk about Sybil Mobley at a presentation. It was the Southern Conference on African American Studies. And even though I started my education at Florida A&M at the School of Business and Industry and was familiar with that institution that Sybil Mobley helped to create and define, I was not aware of some of her legacy. And so as we were working on that and coming up with a concept for these conversations, I definitely wanted to invite her to be a part of this platform to be able to help uplift that legacy. And so, Ameenah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, good evening. Thank you so much to the Florida Humanities Council, also to Dr. Tamika Bradley Hobbs, and also my fellow panelists. I'm happy to be with you this evening. Just trying to get my slides going. So, okay, there we go. As Dr. Bradley Hobbs mentioned, this is an excerpt that I'll be discussing tonight from a longer article that was featured in the Skazy Journal, the GRIO. The title of the article, Dr. Sybil Collins Mobley and the Founding of Florida A&M University's Business and Industry School. So on October 1st, 1991, Southways on National Public Radio aired an interview with Dr. Sybil Collins Mobley, scholar, activist, wife, mother, and founder of Florida A&M University's SBI, or School of Business and Industry. In the interview, Mobley reflected on her vision and mission in creating SBI. She also would develop this idea of SBI as the archetype for collegiate business programs nationwide. When asked by the NPR interviewer, Matt Adelson, what drove her to establish SBI, she rallied up and said very confidently and intensely, "I don't believe in taking a no from a person who doesn't have the authority to say yes." Mobley's tenacity in forging opportunities for African-American students by creating the School of Business and Industry has largely been viewed as an attempt to support the boom in corporate America during the 1980s. Although Mobley's SBI supplied corporations with recurring waves of African-American talent, she preferred to think of these students as a so-called Black army looking to disrupt the discriminatory processes of employment practices that perpetuated both race and sex bias. To this end, Mobley's work really builds on a longer tradition of activism that is rooted in the use of education as a form and a site of liberation within the larger Black freedom struggle. At FAMU in particular, much of this struggle has been cataloged in various articles, also in text by scholars like Ibram Kendi, also by scholars here at FAMU who have written about civil rights activism, in particular scholars Darius Young and also Reginald Ellis, who has also focused a large part on FAMU's history as well. So we do know that in 1956, student activist Carrie Patterson and also Wilhelmina Jakes would lead one of the first major boycotts here in Tallahassee. This activism would not stop. It would continue with other student activists like Patricia Stevens do, along with her sister Priscilla. I'm moving very quickly here. Obviously, we could spend a lot of time here, but this is just so you get an idea of the kind of context that Mobley is working in when she arrives back at Florida A&M University as first as a secretary and moves all the way up to creating a college of business and industry. So we do know that when Mobley was often talked about where she got these leadership ideas from, how she could be thinking outside of the box, much of her orientation about notions of leadership were rooted in self-help models that she had grounded in community contexts that thrived to really help to talk about the exchange between knowledge and commerce. Specifically, Mobley's rearing in the Jim Crow South and Shreveport, Louisiana, are really oriented for her a lifelong approach to thinking about the centering of Black talent as a way to eradicate forms of discrimination in education and labor. So the next two slides that you'll be looking at are examples of census records from that dictate not only her great-grandparents' marriage record, but also her mother and father's lineage within Shreveport, Louisiana. Her father, Melvin Collins, and her mother, Cora Collins, both owned significant tracts of land, upwards into, on the Collins side, as much as 130 acres. And much of their land ownership really reflects the kind of changing flux and patterns of Black land ownership in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so we know Melvin Collins, who is Sybil Collins Mobley's father. I don't have a picture of her mother here, but her mother, Cora Collins, the two of them compiled both of their tracts of land to be able to eventually start a newspaper, which is still in circulation today. That paper, the Shreveport Sun, was a daily paper. Now it's a weekly paper. It is operated by one of the grandchildren of Melvin Collins. But Sybil Collins Mobley often talked about the fact that working in this paper was a full family enterprise. She was one of 5 siblings. And so they all had the responsibility of helping the paper to come to print every single day. But her father, Melvin Collins, used the Shreveport Sun, which was located in the Black business district of Shreveport, known as the Avenue, as also a front and a cover for various forms of activism, particularly during the 1920s, 1930s, and also 1940s in Shreveport, Louisiana. The paper also provided, served as a printing press as well. So many of you are familiar with the fact that many African-American papers, dailies in particular, weeklies later, that were unable to really kind of sustain themselves oftentimes from just printing the news, often doubled to print wedding invitation, graduations invitations, funeral programs. And so the distribution of the newspaper was carried not only by paper boys, but also community members who took the paper often into northern parts of Louisiana. So the readership of this particular paper and that preparation, that daily preparation, which was required by her, really set for her the model for how she would essentially develop the School of Business and Industry. Additionally, in terms of her personal life, she met and married James Otis Mobley, and you're looking here at their 3 young children. They met and married and would settle here in Tallahassee in 1945. Now, Mobley quickly learns when she arrives, and there are all these other connections that essentially bring her here to Tallahassee because of her family's connections to Florida A&M University in particular, and professors who are working there. And so she decides by 1956 that although she is really excited about working at FAMU, largely working as a secretary, working in the College of Arts and then Arts and Humanities, where business education was housed, she decides in 1956 that this is not enough for her and that she wants to go back to school to pursue future education. At this point, she had already graduated from Bishop College, arrives in Tallahassee, and as I said, eventually met and married her husband. Now, she was very fortunate because her husband did own a dry cleaners. He also worked at the original Lincoln High School. And so his financial means allowed her the ability to be able to go back to school. He also took care of all the children while she decided to go and get a master's degree, and ultimately would be one of the first African Americans to receive a PhD in accounting from the University of Illinois, where she still holds the shortest record for receiving that degree, and also publishing while she was there as well. And so she really gets into the idea in the 1950s that she is starting to see this pattern that as we are moving towards in the years after Brown versus Board, an effort to very politicized effort to desegregate, many schools here in the state of Florida. She is seeing early on that there is going to be the phasing out of Black teachers in particular, particularly those who are working in business education. And so her logic is that if she could take her degree as a trained person in the area of accounting, which is also at the same time having this simultaneous boost in what will become corporate America, that she could essentially train what she often referred to, as I said earlier, her Black army. And so for her, this Black army was filled of accountants, right? But she's also thinking about the ways in which these particular members of her so-called Black army, largely students, are going to continue to work within local Black business districts in Tallahassee, right? So Frenchtown in particular, she also would extend some of this work out to Gretna, which I'll talk about in a second. She often referred to this as an ecosystem of Black empowerment. And so most of the documents that I'm using here are either from the Carrie Meek Black Archive on campus, or either they're from the family repository of the Collins or either Mobley's family. This particular set of documents is her sketchings that she rendered to build the Contemporary School of Business and Industry. Prior to this building, this was largely parcels of land that were either houses or businesses. And so she decides that she's going to create this ecosystem. In her ecosystem of what she refers to as the Mobley model, she wants to have talented faculty, talented students, and also connect those students to alumni. And so in her Mobley model, she often talked about the triple C's of consistency. And so she wanted to essentially and did implement this particular vision. So this particular vision you're looking here is from 1972, although the college itself had existed as early as the 1960s, excuse me. And so the School of Business and Industry begins to receive national acclaim, largely because of her ability to recruit what was then known as National Merit Scholars, featured in Newsweek, in the Baltimore Afro-American, Chicago Defender. It's also featured in several other publications as well, like the Black Enterprise, as you're looking at here. And so one of the things that she does is she begins to take a very extensive look at recruitment by recruiting merit scholars, writing them letters where she often called them superstars, going out on her own dime, recruiting students and bringing them back to FAMU, training them in accounting, right? This so-called Black Army. But then she also connects this to her longer history of kind of community building, through a series of business incubators. One of the ones was in Gretna. The Gretna plan, you're looking at this particular document, the Black Enterprise, used loan funds from the credit union at FAMU, connected that with local activists in Gretna, and much of the Gretna plan from 1974, which she starts in 74, would also receive federal funding, and they would do a series of reports about the efficacy of using this particular incubator in Gretna. This was also designed to try to get more African Americans elected on city commissioner seats in Gretna. This is a very kind of complex project that I'm happy to talk about more if there are questions. I'm trying to go as fast as I can. Okay, economic empowerment, right? So she was also, again, a lot of times today we think about kind of how we can have community university partnerships, right? So she was really a leader on this, particularly with developing and working within the Frenchtown Merchants Group. So this was essentially a cooperative and consortium where the university, particularly the School of Business and Industry, through money that Mobley is raising, with giving essentially loans to businesses in Frenchtown. Frenchtown, as some of you may know if you are from Tallahassee, is one of the oldest African-American enclaves in the capital city. So the Frenchtown Merchants Association would loan essentially $20,000 for revolving development of various businesses. This was also featured in the student newspaper for the School of Business and Industry, the SBI report, which you're looking at here. And then lastly, other HBCU collaboration, right? One of the things that Mobley was, although a lot of times people talk about FAMU being featured in Newsweek and competing with Harvard, she really was very intimately concerned with connecting with other HBCUs and producing not only publications, but also activities for students to develop and create further research that was connected to some of those different projects that students were working in, right? So whether it's the Frenchtown Merchants Association, the Gretna Project, right? Her goal was essentially to partner with other HBCUs and create this conglomerate of HBCUs through the International Association of Black Business Educators. She was the president of the International Association of Black Educators from the mid-1960s to the early 1970s. And so what they start to do, because she was very attuned at also garnering federal grants. And so they also use that money to produce, as I said before, a journal, a newsletter. Unfortunately, a lot of these publications do not survive. We have some here in our archive. There are also some located at Alabama A&M in their archives as well. And so I'll stop here because I know I went way over my time. But Mobley and her creation of the School of Business and Industry, I think, remains one of the best examples to talk about kind of the integration of the ways in which we can think about Black women academics as activists, although oftentimes we do not, but definitely much of her work really deems her as an activist. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I went over time. My apologies.
Don't try to clean it up now, but it was time well spent. It's such an impactful story. I love what you said about scholar activism. Right? It's so important. And it kind of goes back to what I said about Black women in leadership positions, creating solutions to real problems. And to think that this legendary School of Business and Industry, which is really I would say one of the crown jewels at Florida A&M University, I know was a very bright beacon for me as a high school student when I decided to and was recruited to come to Florida A&M for that program. But to think that it came out of her recognition of the need to transition Black teachers who were going to lose their jobs as a result of integration. And that in its entirety is an untold story in Black history that I think people should know more about. But she's addressing this real need. And so we have a lot of builders here, builders in actual material when we talk about Mary McLeod Bethune and what Ashley has lifted up for us with Bethune Beach and the hospital, Sybil Mobley when we talk about the School of Business and Industry. When we talk about Zora Neale Hurston, though, it's in another literary field, but also in Black imaginations and the way that we see ourselves and building culture, protecting culture, preserving culture. All of these are incredibly important. It's incredibly important work and why we still call their names today. I want to offer the opportunity for any questions from the audience. I see that we have some comments now. I want to lift up this question from Darius Young, and he says, his name was mentioned tonight. Good evening, Darius. Thank you for being here. This one looks like it's for Ashley, and he's asking, after the passing of the 19th Amendment, Bethune registered women on her campus and in the community. Can Dr. Preston talk about her political work and the institution and the response of the white community, in particular her confrontation of the KKK in Daytona?
You must have read the book. So in 1920, just as she is able to vote now with the passing of this amendment, and I had a chance to talk about this a lot last year in really emphasizing African-American women's role in the suffrage movement. I mean, they were present for all of that, including the 1913 march that occurs, but they've often been written out of history. And so how I relate this back to Bethune's work is that you have the passing of this amendment, but then it's not just the passing, it's also the implementation. And so Bethune takes it upon herself to open up her school to the Black community, to get people registered to vote. She's teaching them how to pass these literacy tests. She's organizing. So this school, as I talked about Mcleod Hospital being a part of the community and training nurses and going out to their homes or to patients' homes, you know, this school is very much involved in addressing the needs of the community. And so in 1920, I talk about it in my text, but also Dr. Paul Ortiz talks about it in his text about how crucial the Black vote was for 1920 and how for many African-American women who are trying to vote during that time, it's a dangerous moment to even be attempting to do this. And so the Klan does show up at her home, show up at her school. In fact, they surround the school in knowing what she's trying to accomplish as far as teaching people how to read so they can pass the literacy test. I mean, she had rallied that community. She had really gotten people on board. This is exactly what we're going to do tomorrow. We're going to go down there and we're going to vote. And so as they surround her school, and keeping in mind at the time, this is still an all-girls school, her and her students, they come out and they start singing hymns. And the Klan, they left, but they had hoped that they would intimidate her. But she still shows up to the polls the next day. And in fact, there is record turnout at the polls amongst African Americans in that 1920 election. So she is not deterred by these things, and I think just overall in the later years of her life, she backs African Americans who are running for city commissioner. I mean, she continues to try to use her influence in that community to become politically engaged.
Well, because as she was aware and the Klan members were aware that civic engagement and voting is a key part of policy change and power. And so there was this contest in power. And just to emphasize, when you talk about the danger of the election of 1920, there were terroristic threats made against African Americans all through the state, threats of bombings. We also know after last year, we're coming out of the centennial and the recognition of the decimation of the Black population in Ocoee. And all of that, of course, was sparked by election violence in 1920. And so the threat of violence was real. You mentioned Dr. Paul Ortiz. He will be with us on Tuesday as we turned our attention to Black women and the history of their political involvement in the state of Florida. So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about that from him, but thank you so much. There is also another question that I wanted to pose to you that comes from Carla Witt Richardson. She's asking about Bethune Hospital, and she wanted to know if was it staffed by African-American doctors?
Yes, so the doctor that I'm not sure if I mentioned his name, but Dr. Texas Adams, he was the first doctor or the overall doctor for Mcleod Hospital. He was actually a graduate of Meharry Medical School, and he was the person that was primarily in charge of the hospital during that time. And so they were able to train. I mean, Dr. Sheila Flemings, she's the one that really talks about the importance of the hospital in her book and how they just became instrumental in the Black community because people didn't have access. And even after Mcleod Hospital, Bethune and many of the leaders in the city, they approached Halifax Hospital and asked them to create a Black annex. And that was also located on the campus of Bethune-Cookman. The General Studies building is actually the old hospital.
Thank you for that. And it keeps coming up in this moment where we have been dealing with health disparities among African Americans, right? With the coronavirus, not only our increased likelihood as Black people to contract the virus, to die from the virus, and now we're dealing with the separate administration of vaccines. It is a really painful reality, but it also speaks to this legacy. And we see in the example of Mary McLeod Bethune, someone who's working towards solutions. I'd like to offer to Ameenah, given that your research has dealt with health justice in a historical context and listening to what we're saying about the work of Mary McLeod Bethune, what examples from the past might you point to that could help us in this particular moment as we deal with this ongoing pandemic and the coronavirus?
I think one of the things that we're seeing and have seen since this latest plague, right, has been kind of the resurgence of public health care and public health care awareness. which was very critical when you think about health in the late 19th century, before the kind of bacterial revolution of antibiotics, vaccines, and all of those things, right? So you see, while many people it may be controversial, right, that one of the mainstays for really combating COVID-19 has really been these kind of public health measures, which have historically, if we think about, say, with the work of people like Dr. Helen Dickens in Philadelphia in the early 20th century, and other Black women physicians, this kind of Black women physician community, nurses, and also lay women who have this medical knowledge, the ways in which they are really relying very heavily on systemizing public health care, right? So whether that is through health weeks, whether that is through holding classes and clinics in churches, this was really largely the purview of Black women. And so we see kind of that resurgence, right? If we want to think about, shout out to my school, FAMU, for being one of the first, right, to have this kind of COVID testing site, right? Really doing various types of advocacy. We really see that rooted in a much longer kind of Black public health tradition that, as Ashley is saying, grows out of these Black hospitals and Black nurses being trained largely as Black institutions as well.
Yeah, shout out to FAMU. I watched with delight as the news of your vaccination site rolled out, and testing site as well before that. I think that's also in the works for us down at Florida Memorial. But it also goes to trust, right? And the institutions that you can trust. I've been volunteering with a church in Miami Gardens, which is the largest Black populated city in the state of Florida. And it's one of the sites of this gap. And so being out there that day and being a part of an effort to try to bridge the gap is something that for me was very important work, and things that we need to see more of, because as has already been laid out kind of painfully in the state of Florida, but for our interventions, we still are going to be left at the margins. When you look at a grocery chain like Publix having access, but then you overlay that with the reality of food deserts and the lack of these grocery stores in Black and brown communities, you're really just echoing and compounding the existing disparities. And so really grateful for that. I know we're out of time, but I want to pivot back to you, Julian, and maybe to wrap us up, and you've been taking all of this in. I just wonder if you, maybe through the lens of Zora Neale Hurston, or just from whatever you've absorbed tonight, could talk about your thoughts and where you are upon reflecting of the legacies of these three women collectively.
Oh yeah, I really appreciate that. Of course, I think one of the things that unites all the examples of female activism represented by these women is centrality of community. If we think about, especially if we think about Hurston as a sort of public intellectual who was advocating very strongly for a Black cultural legacy that should be celebrated and not marginalized in the realm of ideas. Where does that knowledge come from? Well, it comes from the family, the centrality of the mother. It comes from the nature of the relationships. It comes from self-reliance that is often built on spiritual institutions, the church, the school. These are not new ideas in the context of African Americans dealing with trauma and pressure. If we think about COVID-19, these are really revealing sort of established networks that are being geared back up to deal with contemporary questions. And for me in particular, thinking about Hurston sort of cataloging as a journalist the experiences of Black people in the public sphere, as a cultural critic, calling attention to the need to incorporate working class people into these structures that you're advocating for in terms of a mainstream narrative around Blackness. These are not ideas that have gone away. These are ideas that at some level become more important. They've actually, like Hurston herself, taken on transdisciplinary and global connotations, right? This is a person in her own travels went outside the United States to try to understand better the experience of Black people her work is always, I think, associated with an understanding of a diasporic approach. So, you know, are we forgetting the lesson we've already learned? It's always a question that is key to this. I think it's often difficult for us to recognize that, you know, way back when, some of the same ideas are generating the same kind of engagement for Black people. I think that's really true when we start to look at the record in a sort of big way, right? Like, this is one of the things about digital humanities, like, let's just not look at this person, let's look at all the people and see what patterns are there. And the pattern for African Americans in particular, and African American women, is a community centric, is capacity building, is organizational things, right? Like, that's the pattern. So, you know, our past history makes for a future positive story if we're willing to engage with it.
I couldn't agree more. That's why they need us. They need us as historians. That's why I'm so grateful to the Florida Humanities for their continuing commitment to uplift the voices of folks who are doing humanities work, because it does matter. It helps to inform the decisions and the trajectories of the present. And as Julian has educated us tonight, to be able to move forward into the future. I think President Biden should take up that suggestion to create a panel of historians to help him figure this thing out. We need to establish that. But anyway, I want to just conclude before I kick it over to Keith to close us out. I want to thank all of you for accepting the invitation and sharing your brilliance with the audience tonight. It's really great to have been with you. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Keith.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hobbs, and thank you again for all of our panelists for joining us this evening. I mean, honestly, I'm not sure if there's really a more dynamic way to sort of kick off the weekend with a lot of really fascinating stories. I've got some more reading that I know for sure I'm going to have to do. And thanks again for all of our audience members that joined us this evening. Hopefully, we're going to see you back on Tuesday at 6 p.m. That's when we're going to wrap up this series with our third program, Refusing to be Silenced, the Political History and Future of Black Women in Florida. And again, you're going to receive an evaluation in your email. We would appreciate if you took a few moments to fill it out for us. And other than that, again, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.